Well, today we're going to talk a little bit about how do we manage weeds when we're seeding cover crops. The main reason for this is as we start thinking about new ways to integrate things like cover crops into our crop rotations, one of the key things that we always try to figure out is, okay, well, we know we have to control weeds, so what are the herbicides that I can use that are not going to kill my cover crops? What we do know is there are several different benefits to cover crops, whether it's looking at weed control or looking at protecting your soil from erosion, also soil health benefits. There's all sorts of benefits to using cover crops, but there are also some challenges. And one of the biggest challenges that we do have is they can be in competition with weeds. So we got to make sure that we can control those weeds so those cover crops can establish well. And then also the incompatibility with different herbicides, because just like if you're growing a crop, sometimes the herbicides that we use may also control the cover crop, not just the weeds. So this is really what we're trying to do, is really look at what herbicides can we use in a integrated system to make sure that we can seed cover crops. So we've looked at a lot of these different systems. We've looked at interseeding cover crops into corn. We've looked at fall seedings after soybean harvest, and we've also looked at some interseeding into wheat. What I thought I would do is talk a little bit about each one of the different research types projects that we've had, and really start talking about what our results have been and what herbicides you might be able to use if you're using a cover crop into one of these systems. So what I'm going to talk about first is really looking at broadcast interseeding cover crops into corn. This has definitely become a lot more popular over the last several years. There's a lot of different systems that people can use. This is an example of basically a sprayer that was converted over into a cover crop interseeder, where it is a broadcast interseeder and it just blows the cover crops down in between the rows. Dr. Karen Renner and one of her graduate students, Erin Brooker, have looked at how early you can go with this without causing effects on yield. And there's a lot of different information out there, but what we're really going to focus on today is what effect herbicides have on some of these different covers that we're going to be interseeding in corn. Over the last 3 years, we've had several different experiments where we've looked at some of these different herbicides, in particular focusing on a multitude of different cover crops. And you can see some of the locations that we've had over the last 3 years and some of the different locations. So we have a good range in soil type as well as different environmental conditions that we might see from year to year. One of the things that we wanted to do is really look at all the different herbicide active ingredients that could be used in corn from a pre-emergent side, and then coming back and interseeding later. And you can see this long list of herbicides that we looked at. If you look at this list, it's pretty much every single active ingredient that can now be used in corn pre-emergence or soil applied. And then a lot of these different pre-emergence products are sold either by themselves or also in different mixtures. So we basically looked at the standard rates of these herbicides and applied each one of these into strips, and then came back later and interseeded our cover crop into these different strips to see what the tolerance levels were. So you can see we had what we would consider the group 2 herbicides or the ALS inhibitors, things like Python and Resolve. Those are also in several premixes. We had a group 4 herbicide in Stinger, atrazine, which is very common in many of our premixes, which is a group 5, Sharpen. We've looked at a lot of the group 15 herbicides, things like Harness, Outlook, Zidua, and Dual 2 Magnum, which are pretty standard in most of our weed control programs. And then looked at what we would consider our group 27 herbicides, which are the HPPD inhibitors. And you'll see the product bicyclopyrone. This is one of the components of the premixture Acuron, so we wanted to look at that by itself to see if there's any differences between that and something like a Balance Flex or a Callisto. We also looked at some of these different products that can be used post-emergence in corn for weed control as kind of an early post-emergence timing, usually when the corn was at the V2 to V3 stage, and that was these herbicides were applied prior to the interseeding. So it wouldn't be like the cover crop was up and then we sprayed it. It would be the corn's up, the weeds are there, we're trying to control those weeds, and then we're going to come back and interseed. So the herbicides that we looked at for that were things like atrazine, Buctril, Cadet, Warrant, Callisto, Lotus, and Impact, which is also sold as Armazon. So these are all different products that can be used. We also looked at some of the different combinations that are sold out there. So something like a Status, looking at some Callisto plus atrazine at 2 different rates of atrazine, Armazon Pro, Caprino, and also Halix GT. So you can see what some of these different premixtures are. And again, these are all very commonly used as early post-emergence weed control options in corn. The different cover crops we examined where we had the best data was actually with interseeding annual ryegrass and also interseeding tillage radish. So you can see here our seeding rates, 15 pounds per acre of annual ryegrass, and again, tillage radish would be 8 pounds per acre. So these were all broadcast interseeded in between the corn rows at 2 different timings. And the 2 different timings that we looked at were when the corn was at the V3 stage, so that's about 2 weeks after planting, and then we also had some strips where we looked at when the corn was at V6 stage, which would be about approximately 5 weeks after planting. So again, our pre-emergence herbicides were applied right at planting. We came back, interseeded at V3, and then some of the treatments at V6. Or if we're using the post-emergence herbicide applications, we made those applications just prior to the broadcast interseeding of the cover crops. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we found. And what was very interesting is with annual ryegrass, because this is one that really comes up in a thick, dense stand, as you can see by this picture, it really did not tolerate any of our group 15 herbicides, regardless of when we put it on, whether it was at the V3 timing or at the V6 timing. And those group 15 herbicides are very common from a pre-emergent side in corn. So things like Harness, Warrant can be used early post-emergence, Dual Tube Magnum, there's a lot of generics out there, again, the Metolachlor, Zidua, and then also Outlook. So anytime we had a group 15 product, we just were not able to establish a good stand of annual ryegrass. Some of the products that were safe to use, we've got a good list here, and it's really looking at what the products are as well as what their herbicide set of action group is. And these were all safe to interseed after these pre-emergence applications, either if the interseeding happened at V3 or V6. So things like atrazine, the 3 HPPD inhibitors that we looked at, Balance Flex, Bicyclopyrone, Callisto, Sharpen, Stinger, Roundup, Liberty. Again, prior to making that interseeding, all these herbicides were safe. If we want to look at these herbicides, we'll just kind of go through what some of the weeds are that they will control. You can see this group that I have highlighted here are good for residual broadleaf weed control. We look at the other ones. These really just do not give you any residual weed control. Ones that would give us some grass control would be something like a Balance Flex. And then some of the weeds that we're more concerned about, some of the pigweed species like water hemp and also common lamb's quarters. So things like atrazine, Balance Flex, Callisto, and Sharpen would all give us good residual control of those weed species. So just kind of thinking about what are some of the weeds we're trying to manage, as well as trying to, again, establish the annual ryegrass. And some of these herbicides are actually pretty good on velvet leaf. So all of our group 27 herbicides, as well as Sharpen. When we look at the post-emergence herbicides that we looked at, again, these were all applied prior to our interseeding, where we saw it, where it was safe for annual ryegrass were pretty much a lot of our broadleaf herbicides like atrazine, Callisto, Buctril, and then some of these that just really do not have any residual control like Cadet, Roundup, or Liberty, as well as Buctril. So again, you can see our 2 that would give us some residual broadleaf weed control would be atrazine and Callisto. And in general, we had very good stands of annual ryegrass after those products were applied prior to the interseeding. And we had some combinations of these. We might have saw just a little bit of stand reduction, but in general, we had very good establishment overall. The next one we're going to talk about is tillage radish. Again, this was one of the other cover crops that we had that did a really good job of establishing. These are some of the pictures that were taken after corn was harvested, and you can see the tillage radish in this system. What tillage radish did not tolerate was our ALS inhibiting herbicides, which are the group 2 herbicides. So those were things like Python, Resolve, and then Caprino, which is a premixture that has an ALS herbicide in it. The ones that were safe to use were quite a bit different depending on when we did the interseeding. So if we were to interseed the corn, the cover crops into the corn at the V3 stage, we had a little fewer options than if we waited until V6. So some of the safe ones you can see that would give us residual broadleaf weed control were things like atrazine, bicyclopyrone, again, this is a component of Acuron, Sharpen, and Stinger. And then also we have our non-residuals, which would be the Roundup and the Liberty. From a post-emergent side, again, Bucktrill looked good from a V3 interseeding timing. So these herbicides, again, were applied prior to tillage radish being interseeded. Bucktrill, Armazon, also sold as Impact, Roundup, and Liberty were all safe. When we look at the V6 interseed timing, so it gives us a little bit more time for those herbicides to break down and maybe be a little bit safer to the tillage radish, we do see that we have a few more herbicides that are added to that list. So again, we have things like atrazine, Balance Flex, bicyclopyrone, Callisto, and then our group 15 herbicides of Dual 2 Magnum, Harness, and Outlook. So later on, we were able to use some of those. So again, just giving it enough time to break down. And again, this is for tillage radish, Sharpen and Stinger, and then Roundup and Liberty. And again, those, the group 15s, the Dual 2, Magnum, Harness, and Outlook will give us some residual grass control. From our post-emergent side, really what we saw was the Bucktrill, Armazon, Impact, Roundup, and Liberty were all safe to use prior to interseeding at the V6 time with tillage radish. So a lot of times we're talking about with these different cover crops that many of these things are seeded as mixtures. And what we have is annual ryegrass and tillage radish that established very well. And we can see that these are the ones that if you had a mixture of those two, you could safely apply things like atrazine and then pre-emergence and then come back at V3 or V6 and interseed those two cover crop species, bicyclopyrone, Sharpen, Stinger, Roundup, and Liberty. At the V6 only timing, again, that's where we pick up something like a Balance Flex and a Callisto. The one thing that I want to point out here is one of the products or the groups of products that we usually apply to give us some good grass control, which were those group 15 herbicides. In general, we're not going to be able to use because of annual ryegrass's sensitivity to those. So we're really looking at some of these products that'll give us some broadleaf weed control. Some of these do have some residual control, but things like Roundup and Liberty would not. And again, those would control the grasses that are up at that time. When we look at our post options, we have things like Bucktrill and again, Roundup or Liberty. So again, making these applications prior to the interseeding of either one of those two cover crops. We did look at several other cover crops, but some of them are a little bit harder to establish in an broadcast interseeded system. So where we feel very good about a lot of our herbicide work is with these two cover crops. The next thing I want to talk about is some of the work that we've done looking at fall drilled cover crops and some of the different soil applied soybean herbicides that can be used. So again, we have a lot of different pre-emergence herbicides that we do use in soybeans, and these soybean herbicides are really, these residual herbicides are used to help manage a lot of the broadleaf weed species, in particular as we start looking at some of the herbicide resistant or glyphosate resistant weeds that we're starting to see in Michigan. When we look at the list that we have, what we tried to do is look at some of the more popular single active ingredient herbicides, things like Classic, Pursuit, First Rate, which are all group 2 herbicides. We also looked at metribuzin, which is very popular to use, especially for glyphosate resistant horseweed or mare cell control. Some of the group 14 herbicides, Spartan and Valor, which are also very popular, and then also the group 15 herbicide, Zidua, which is another important herbicide in from a residual standpoint in soybeans. We did look at some other mixtures, and the mixtures that we looked at were all the different types of authority products. So these pre-mixtures you can see all have sulfentrazone or Spartans, and they're all called authority something. And then the addition, like authority assist, would also have basically Spartan plus Pursuit, and authority first would be Spartan plus First Rate, and you can see what those mixtures are. So in looking at our results, again, these are soil applied. They're applied late May, early June, and then after soybean harvest, this is when we would do our drilling in our cover crops. What we did is we drilled in cover crops, the oilseed radish, we looked at medium red clover and cereal rye, and you can see the seeding rates there. And again, these were drilled after at a typical time when after soybeans would have been harvested. And looking at the different cover crop species, oilseed radish did have very good tolerance to many of the herbicides that we tested. We did see a little bit of injury with Authority Max or the high rate of Spartan, which is 12 fluid ounces, and that injury ranged from about 15 to 38%. And you can see it was basically just a little bit of discoloring on that oilseed radish. When we went and looked at stand and biomass comparisons compared to the untreated over the couple of years that we did this, we saw no differences. So basically oilseed radish tolerated most of our soil applied herbicides that we used prior to soybean planting. When we looked at medium red clover, we had a little bit wider range in injury, 10 to 50%. And again, it was really just looking at those 2 herbicides that caused that injury. So there was a lot of very safe herbicides. The 2 where we saw injury was Authority Max, and then again, a high rate of Spartan, which would be 12 fluid ounces per acre. And this would have been 12 or 28 days after planting. When we look at the biomass, basically we looked at biomass in the spring, and we really saw that there was no differences on the control for those 2 herbicides. However, they were the lowest biomass that we saw compared to many of the other herbicides that we had used. With the other herbicides, no differences in biomass, and you can see we had a nice full clover stand. So again, applying those herbicides as a pre-emergence in soybeans to give us some residual control, and then coming back in the fall and doing our seeding of those 3 cover crops, medium red clover was able to tolerate a lot of the different herbicides. The other one that's very popular to apply after either soybean harvest or even after corn harvest is cereal rye. Basically, we saw very little injury, and so everything that we looked at, it was safe. So we didn't see any differences in our stand or biomass with the cereal rye. So kind of looking at just kind of a chart on whether we can use these herbicides or if they should be cautioned. We've set up this chart where we've listed all the different herbicides that we looked at, the use rate that we looked at, as well as the herbicide site of action number, and then really looked at the 3 different cover crops. So for example, with oilseed radish, you can see that we had very good tolerance with many of the herbicides, and we gave a couple cautions again with the Spartan and the Authority Max, where we did see a little bit of that discoloration on those radish plants. Clover, basically again, these herbicides were very safe to be applied in the spring, and then drilling in clover in the fall. Again, caution with the same 2 herbicides, the Authority Max or the high rate of Spartan. And then looking at cereal rye, everything we could use anything. So cereal rye is very tolerant to a lot of the herbicides. We've got a lot of time for those herbicides to break down and be able to drill in rye in the fall. And finally, one of the other things that we've done looking at trying to figure out how to incorporate some of these different covers and what tolerance of herbicides is really looking at frost-seeded medium red clover and wheat. We've looked at fall versus spring herbicide applications. A lot of these herbicides that we've looked at are ones that are commonly used in wheat, things like Affinity Broadspec, Huskie, Osprey for more grass control, PowerFlex for more grass control, also Clarity, 2,4-D, and MCPA. We looked at both fall and spring applications. Just want to mention, we should not be applying 2,4-D in the fall. We can get quite a bit of wheat injury from that, so that's one of those things we want to be cautious of. And this is looking at our frost-seeded clover injury, and this is after we've harvested wheat. And you can see basically with our fall herbicides, we had fairly low fall applied herbicides of any of these products. Injury was fairly low. Probably the most that we saw was from PowerFlex. However, in the spring, we saw quite a bit of injury when we've frost-seeded the clover and came back and made our spring herbicide applications. And you can see really the only one that was safe to use was MCPA. Here's just a few pictures comparing the fall versus spring. Again, this is right after wheat harvest. So we've got a fall application of Affinity Broadspec, frost seeding, medium red clover, looks great. When we made that application in the spring, we reduced our clover stand substantially. Basically saw the same thing with Huskie. The other thing I want to point out is we have seen from some of our fall applications, we might see some whitening around that leaf tissue, but in general, we have good establishment even when we do see some of this bleaching. Osprey, maybe a little bit of a stand reduction from that fall application, but in general, it is fairly safe to use. And you can see from a spring application, we've pretty much wiped out that whole clover stand. PowerFlex, again, a little bit less of a stand from the fall, but overall we had some establishment, and spring we have basically no establishment. So really just kind of looking at which wheat herbicide you could use if you're frost seeding. A lot of it is going to be dependent on when you make those herbicide applications. So in some cases, people will make these applications in the fall, particularly if they're trying to control something like some of the winter annual grasses like a common windgrass. And you can see here our fall applications, everything we could use, a little bit of caution on the Osprey and PowerFlex. With spring applications, the only product that I would recommend using would be MCPA. We've also looked at a couple of other products, Qlex and then also Axial XL that were not in the original study. And with Qlex, again, I wouldn't recommend doing a frost seeding of clover. We would just not get stand establishment. And Axial XL, it is a grass herbicide, so it is not going to affect the clover, so that is safe. So just want to acknowledge a lot of our funding sources and partners in doing a lot of this work. We've received funding from Project Green, as well as the Corn Marketing Program of Michigan, the Michigan Wheat Program, and also from the Michigan Soybean Promotion Committee. So with that, I hope this information is helpful in helping you choose some of your herbicide cover crop combinations. So for more information about herbicides and their interactions with cover crops, please visit our MSU Weeds website. You can get there by going to www.msuweeds.com. And we also have some of those recommendations in our 2019 Weed Control Guide for Field Crops.